Okay, so commercial auto insurance is the topic for this week. I just wanted to spend some time making sure that people are familiar with some of the big exposures that show up when you talk about a business that owns autos and has employees use them in the course of business. There's some unique exposures there. And it's interesting because the first one that we're going to talk about is actually the less important of the two, if you ask me. First, they're going to talk about the property exposure of owning automobiles, right? So you own autos, and as property, something could happen to damage them, right? You could have a hailstorm destroy your vehicle. You could have somebody steal your vehicle. It could be involved in an accident where the vehicle itself gets destroyed. Those are property exposures. And that's the first thing that the chapter talks about. But if you're a business owner and you own autos, that's not the biggest source of loss that you're concerned about by a long shot. The biggest thing that you're worried about is liability. And liability can come from a whole bunch of different directions. It's obvious that if you have an employee in the course of business driving an automobile, that any liability they create is going to attach to you as the employer. Everybody understands that. I send my employee out to do a service job, and on the way they smack into somebody and cause some damage. All that liability is covered by me as the employer. And that's an easy one to imagine, but that can be some big dollars. I mean, hundreds of thousands of dollars for serious injuries that involve medical expenses, that's not uncommon. And millions isn't out of the question if you talk about somebody who's dramatically injured, permanent disability. Think about lifetime loss of earnings for that person who's permanently disabled. That could be millions of dollars. To say nothing of the actual medical treatment that you need. Fortunately, those losses are rare, but they can happen. And that's a liability loss. Sometimes liability attaches to you as the business owner because you own the vehicle, right? Maybe it's common for people to let their employees drive cars to and from work. And then once you accept that, you also accept that there's going to be some driving that's probably personal in nature, right? I mean, it's a huge employee benefit to have a personal vehicle that your employer actually owns. But when that happens, you're going to be using that thing to go to the store and to pick the kids up from their activities. That's just the nature of how that goes. Once the employer opens that door and allows employees to use it for personal use, that exposure is going to be there. You're doing your employee a huge favor because that's one less vehicle that their family has to own. And that's huge, to say nothing of the cost of the vehicle, the cost of insuring the vehicle, the cost of maintaining the vehicle. That's a very valuable employee benefit. But you can't underestimate the liability that you're taking on. You're the owner of that vehicle. And regardless of the use, whoever is using that vehicle, a good attorney on the other side, if the dollars are big enough, they're going to look for the deepest pockets. And it's going to matter that you're the owner of the vehicle. That's just going to mean that you have responsibility. That's how lawsuits work. They're trying to sue as many different people who could possibly be held responsible in the hopes that just one will be found responsible, and then they're going to look for the deepest pockets. Who's got the best ability to pay? That person's getting sued. And a lot of times that's going to be a company, even if they didn't have much to do with the situation other than owning the vehicle. That's enough. As a business owner, you have to know that whatever vehicles you own, no matter how somebody drives them, just the ownership of the vehicle means that you're going to be liable if something goes wrong, or at least a very high likelihood that you could be held liable if something goes wrong. So you just got to be thinking about that kind of stuff. I'll give you a real quick example. That was a foolish decision on our business's part. So when I was working for our family business, I always drove company vehicles. That was my vehicle, was a company vehicle, and whatever personal use there was, that was part of it too. So I drove pickups, trucks for a long time. Finally, I ended up actually getting a passenger car, but it was the hardware that bought that. It was our family business that bought that for me. That was an employee benefit for me. That's all well and good, but then I left. And I took that car with me down to Florida State, where I got my graduate education, and I was driving that thing all over Tallahassee. It's still owned by my family business while I was doing that. Had I gotten into an accident, I'm covered by my personal auto insurance, and if the accident is small enough, nobody's going to care. But if it would have been a big accident, I promise you, if attorneys had gotten involved and looked at the ownership, they would have said, whoa, we've got a business here that owns this vehicle. We're going to sue them too. So that was a huge liability exposure potentially that probably wasn't very wise. In the end, I ended up, not driving that car for too long, so it didn't really matter. I mean, no harm, no foul kind of thing, right? But in the meantime, we really took on a bunch of risk that was a big mistake. There was no reason to do it that way. We could have just had a handshake deal where I buy the vehicle when I left for some nominal amount. I mean, the amount doesn't have to be disclosed in some states. So yeah, I'll buy the car for $50 and now it's mine. And at least now we've gotten rid of the liability. So if you're a business owner and you've got people driving those vehicles, you just need to know that by virtue of the fact that you own the vehicle, you potentially have a liability exposure, even if you're not related to whatever it is that happens. Something worth thinking about. Okay, so really there's three coverages that end up getting talked about in auto, in commercial auto. The biggest one is business auto coverage and the form that goes with that. So this is the most common exposure. There's lots of businesses that own vehicles. We have to figure out how we're going to be able to A, cover the property, the vehicle itself. What if something happens to the vehicle itself? And then B, what if something happens for liability exposure while somebody's driving that, whether it's an employee, whether it's somebody else, keeping in mind that if we own the vehicle, we have a potential liability exposure. Then we have the garage coverage form. That's specific for businesses that end up doing repair work on customers' autos, for example. So the customer brings in an auto and they leave it in your care, custody, and control. So now you have property damage coverage for your customer's auto. You also have some liability that can arise from that too. So we've got garage coverage form. It's a specifically designed coverage for those businesses that take custody of customers' vehicles, usually service businesses. So that's a Bailey coverage like we talked about in inland marine, right? The customer is bringing the car to me for mutual benefit. They're going to get it repaired. I'm going to get paid to repair it. But in the meantime, it's in my care, custody, and control. And that means insuring against possible damage is something that I have to worry about. It's their property exposure. Viewed from my perspective, it's a liability exposure. And I don't want to get too far into detail, but the interesting thing here, we talked about this in inland marine coverage. Legally, I'm only liable for damage that results from my negligence. But if something happens and I'm not negligent and it damages my customer's property, they're not going to care. They're still going to expect that they get reimbursed, right? It's parked on my property and a tree falls on it. They're not going to say, oh, well, yeah, that just could happen. They're going to expect that if it happened on my property, I'm going to cover it. Legally, I probably would not be held liable for that. So that's an issue. And you might want to think about designing your coverage in a way to preserve customer goodwill, where we say, look, even if something happens and it's not my fault, we're not going to argue about fault. We're just going to take care of it. And there is a way to design coverage to keep your customers happy. You'll be glad to know. Then we have the motor carrier coverage form. So some businesses are involved in transporting property, and that's a different type of risk. So not surprisingly, we've got a different coverage form that can handle that type of risk. So that's kind of the overview of the broad coverages that we're going to look at here in this particular chapter. So like I promised, the first one that the book takes on is the property exposure. And again, this isn't the biggest one. The loss of the value of the auto. You know, the nice thing about that is that we can put a dollar figure on that. We can figure the worst case. So we're not going to get surprised if this auto gets damaged. We might get surprised by the loss, but the idea that it could happen should not come as a surprise. Then we have the problem of, all right, my auto has been destroyed and I can't use it in the meantime. And that's a big deal. I can tell you in our propane business, where you have specialized vehicles, it's that loss of use that's a real problem. Yeah, you lose the value of the auto, but whoa, we still need to deliver propane, and we only had 2 trucks. And if one of them goes down for an extended period of time, whoa, that's a big problem. You know, propane delivery is something you have to pretty much do during daylight hours, right? I mean, no customer wants you pulling into their yard at 2 o'clock in the morning. You're limited. And then it's not safe to be driving around hazardous materials at night. You really only want to operate during the daytime hours, but both of our trucks were always busy. So if we lose one of them, that's a real problem. Somehow we have to get a substitute. Where do you get a substitute propane vehicle? Well, as it turns out, we had that happen. And that is not an easy thing to try to figure out. Actually, as it happened, the way we handled it, we had a competitor that we were friendly with that actually allowed us to borrow one of their vehicles. Didn't charge us anything, just stepped in and said, hey, we got a truck we're not using. If you want to use it, you sure can. And we're competitors, right? So it's worth thinking. This is another lesson for risk management. If you're going to run a business, it's worth keeping in mind that your competitors and you have similar interests. You don't have to be enemies. And in fact, it's usually not wise to be enemies. When people start out and they try to hurt other people, then they're willing to do all kinds of crazy things that are not in their self-interest. You're better off keeping friendly relationships. And sometimes something like this could happen. So they let us borrow their propane truck for nothing. They didn't expect anything at all. And I'm still to this day thinking, wow, that was a really decent and kind thing for them to do. We didn't really overlap very much in territory, but I can tell you, I'm never going to go try and steal their customers with price, right? If one of their customers calls me, I'm going to say, you know what, they're pretty good people. I don't know if price is the reason you want to come with us. I don't know if that's good enough. I wouldn't be aggressive in trying to take that competitor's customers after them just doing us a favor like that. All right, didn't mean to go too far along on an example that's a little bit out of the realm here, but if you lose a specific vehicle, the loss of use of that can be significant. It might be more than the value of the auto itself. I can tell you in the case of a propane truck, if one of our trucks goes down, I'd be willing to pay a big amount of money, probably as much as the value of a truck. I might go out and buy a new truck to handle the loss of use. I might be willing to do that just because loss of use is something that we can't handle for more than a few days, maybe a week. So yeah, the loss of value of the auto, if we have auto physical damage coverage, the analog to that is going to be what we call collision and other than collision insurance in the personal auto policy. In the commercial auto policy, we use the term, we've got collision and then we've got comprehensive. And that's meaning other than collision types of things. Then we have another coverage, rental reimbursement endorsement. So that can cover that second, the loss of use. It's a little bit easier to imagine when you're talking about, yep, I have a vehicle and I need to rent a replacement. If it's not a specialized vehicle, that's much more easily done. But that is also something you can insure. When you think about vehicles and things that can go wrong, the likelihood of loss, some of the likelihood of loss types of incidents are higher, right? A vehicle might be worth $20,000 and theft of a $20,000 vehicle is probably more common than, say, customer theft of $20,000 of inventory, right? That's just not very likely. Not to say it's impossible, but that's not going to happen. It's much more likely we're going to have a vehicle get stolen. So in that case, the exposure is probably higher. And then some of them are lower. You think about the risk of flood to a building. Well, you're kind of stuck with it. The risk is what the risk is. You can keep stuff off the ground. If you know a flood is coming, you can sandbag, you can move things. But a vehicle, you can drive away. You can take that risk down to zero, which incidentally is one of the reasons that you can privately insure vehicles against flood. Buildings, generally, you can't. We talked about that. Private insurance against flood is usually hard to come by. We have a government program that insures flood, but it's got limits. And so big exposures are a problem. So the flood exposure for a vehicle is probably quite a bit lower than the flood exposure for a building. And it's enough difference that it makes it possible to insure one and not the other. Then we get to the bigger one, I think, is the liability exposure. And again, just by virtue of the fact that you own a vehicle, if you own it, the liability is likely yours. Someone will find a way to tie that back to you, even if the circumstances really didn't have anything to do with you. In the case where the vehicle is stolen, all right, you probably don't have to worry about it. But anybody who's using the vehicle with your permission, the liability is almost certainly going to attach to you, which is fine. You just need to let that play a role in your decision-making process when you think about who am I going to allow to have access to this vehicle. Just remember the liability is yours. And that comes mostly from the doctrine of respondeat superior. So if we've got an employee in the course of employment, then the auto liability is going to be mine. And we call that vicarious liability. It means I'm liable for something that somebody else did. Their liability ultimately attaches to me. Their actions attach to me if I'm their employer and I'm in control of telling them what to do and when to do it. This is pretty well established legal doctrine. If it's your employee and they're in the course of employment, you're going to be liable for everything they do. And if it involves a vehicle, it's not any different. So now we do have, it's got to be in the course of employment. So your employee is driving their car that they own to work. They're on their way to work. They get into an accident. And the person who gets hurt tries to sue the employer, saying that, hey, well, they're going to work for your benefit. That's not good enough. That's not considered the course of employment. But once they punch in, then they're on the clock doing what you tell them to do. And if that's a place where liability is going to attach to the employer. So this commercial auto policy is written in a way, if you read it in the policy, it says it covers liability of the insured arising from ownership, maintenance, or use. Maintenance is hard to come up with an example. Liability out of use of this vehicle. Yep, you're going to be responsible for that. Liability coming from the ownership. So we're just going to flat out say, yep, we'll cover you for that. That's right in the definition. So that's for owned autos. But we have other auto exposures that can create liability for us that we don't own, right? What if we borrow somebody's auto? And I just gave you an example while we're driving around our competitor's truck. Yeah, they own it. They could potentially be liable, but we're going to be liable too as the one who's operating it. And ultimately, we'll have to figure out if there's an accident, who's ultimately going to be responsible there. So borrowed auto, yep, that's going to be yours. Hired auto, you're doing some type of lease arrangement. Liability assumed under a contract. Sometimes when you lease somebody else's vehicle, you sign a contract saying, I'm holding you harmless. I'm accepting all the liability. That's a liability exposure you'd have if you signed it something like that. Anytime you rent a car on a personal level, you're doing that. Whether you realize it or not, that's one of the signatures you're giving is you're saying, I'm taking all liability, and the rental company, even though they own it, we are absolving them of liability through contract. And that's how that's happening. So your business can do that too when your business rents a car. What happens when I don't own the car, but somebody else is driving the vehicle for my benefit? Well, we call that employer's non-ownership liability. And that's another place where liability can come in. So the employee uses their personal car to run an errand for me. Well, if it's for my benefit, then I'm going to be responsible for that liability most likely. And then we mentioned the Bailey loss exposures. So from my perspective, this is a liability. Somebody gives me their car to work on, something happens to it. It's their property loss, but it's my liability loss in the sense that I damaged their property and they're going to hold me responsible. So those are other places where liability exposures can come from. We have personal exposures that we have to worry about too. Sometimes the most obvious one is when somebody who's injured in an accident makes a liability claim against me. Other coverages can help here if they're injured. They may have some first party Part B medical payments coverage that might help them a little bit. We've got, in some states, we've got required coverages. We've got personal injury protection, PIP. Florida has a PIP, Michigan has a PIP. There's a couple other states that do that. And so if you're going to operate in those states, you need to be aware of how that works. It's usually no fault coverage, and it says your driver has to have this coverage to protect them from relatively small incidents. So PIP coverage is first party. I carry it on myself. So if I'm an employer, I have to cover my employees here on that because it's related to auto. It's a specific type of coverage I have to have. Uninsured motorists, some states mandate that you carry that. So to protect yourself in case somebody else damages you, and it should be their liability, but they didn't buy insurance for whatever reason. So uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage, some states mandate. And so we can build that into your commercial exposure as well. And then I mentioned that sometimes auto medical payments coverage can fit in here too. All right, last thing I want to talk about, let's just give you a real brief overview of what the form looks like. We got 5 sections. All right, the first section talks about which autos are covered. Okay, and you can do this a bunch of different ways. It can be any auto at all, any auto that ends up with liability, and that's the broadest one. That's the one I would recommend if you have a choice. That's what you want. We can have autos that are owned, and that'll cover the autos that you currently have and any autos that you acquire during the policy period. You don't have to do anything. It's just owned autos. There's another way to do it. We'll talk about symbol 7, which is specifically listed autos. So you could actually write out on a list, these are the autos that I want covered, no others. Couple risks there. We'll talk more about that as we move on. But the biggest one is, well, what if you acquire a brand new auto and you don't change the list? Well, then you're not covered for liability under that. If you've chosen symbol 7 and you acquire a new auto and you don't say anything, that was the deal. We'll talk more about that in the next slide. Section 2 talks about liability coverage and how that works. And then Section 3 talks about the physical damage coverage. So 2 types of coverage here that we've got. The damage to your property and then the damage that you do to other people. That's liability. Liability Section 2. Damage to my auto is Section 3. Then we have conditions that we'll go over in Section 4. And then Section 5 contains all our definitions. Remember, as you're reading through a policy, anything that shows up in quotes, that means we've got a specific definition that we've got to look up. That term means something very specific, and to find out where it is, you got to go to Section 5 and look. Okay, that's a good place to cut off this lecture for a start. We'll pick up from there on the next time. Thanks, guys.